Well, we've got next is long exposure noise reduction. We talked about how ISO can create noise, higher ISOs. Well, so can long exposures, because your sensor is active and that little charge that's generating over a period of time is going to start creating noise. So you have the ability, once again, to come into the camera and turn on long exposure noise reduction, say if you're shooting night shots or just any kind of low light type of shooting. Personally, I do all my noise reduction later again in post-production, but for those who aren't so image editing savvy or feel like they want to spend that kind of time there, these are things you can do in camera. There's also the high ISO noise reduction. Now, the one thing about that, it does a great job actually. It does a pretty fair job. I'm impressed with it. But what happens is if I take a 1 minute exposure, the camera needs an additional minute to process that image. So when I'm out shooting and things are happening, I don't feel like I've got that time to spend while it's processing it. So just be aware, if you do activate the high ISO noise reduction setting, every picture you take, whether it's 8 seconds, 2 minutes, it's going to take twice as long for the camera to be ready for the next frame.
And the other thing that I discovered about a year or so ago working with Joe, I had set his cameras to have both of those options on, I think maybe it was just a long exposure, but one of those was on. And whenever he was shooting bursts of pictures, you know, with the continuous high setting, the buffer was smaller. So it decreases the buffer size, which is how many pictures you can take and then how long it takes to process the images. And so he wasn't able to take as many, and it took longer to process them in the camera. And so he knew something wasn't right and asked if I had turned that on, and that's what it was. So whenever you turn those on, it affects the speed that you're able to shoot at.
Absolutely. Real world experiences, you know, that you kind of learn by trial and error sometimes out in the field, and you learn what works and what doesn't. We've got ISO sensitivity settings. Again, you've got the ISO capabilities externally on the camera, but you also have them set here in the menu. And what you have here in the menu is if you turn that on, you can actually set it to like a governor or a limit where it can't exceed a particular ISO if you choose. I'm wanting to be in control of my images as much as possible. I tend to just let the camera stay at its full range, and then I will choose as I'm shooting which I want most.
So it's almost like another exposure compensation kind of thing, where if you set your aperture, it'll adjust the shutter speed, or if you say your shutter speed, it'll set the aperture. With this, if you set your ISO, it will, you know, adjust accordingly, or if there's a minimum shutter speed on here. So if you set that, it'll adjust your ISO accordingly.
Correct. Similar to exposure compensation, but not really, because it's not actually changing the overall exposure.
Right.
But what it's saying is, you know, we've got this exposure triangle, and if one thing changes and you want the same exposure, something else has to change.
So the more proper analogy would have been priority.
A priority.
Priority setting, not exposure compensation.
Perfect.
Priority. That's
great, though. No problem. That's a good, I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's true. You may find that, you know, rather than shooting at really long exposures, you've set your ISO to 400, and you can't shoot below 15th of a second. Well, you can put a governor or a limiter on here, and if it's starting to drop below that, it's going to kick the ISO up.
Right.
There's always a situation of compromise, so which one is going to be more important to you? Okay, the next setting is the live view setting. Now, that's accessible up here on the external part of the camera again, but what you have when you go into the menu is to select two different modes. You've got handheld or tripod. When you're in handheld mode, you've got the camera knows you're doing handheld, and it functions accordingly. When you're in tripod mode, you actually have this option of setting it up on the tripod, activating live view, and you can zoom in and tweak the focus for fine focus, zoom back out, and then kick in and start shooting. So that's kind of a handy setting for, you know, when you're trying to get that real critical focus. Then the second one is your release mode. So when you're in live view, the default is single advance. Well, if you're shooting continuously, you may want to kick it into either the low speed or the high speed. Keep in mind, though, if you're in autofocus, live view is the focus doesn't work quickly. So it's not a great thing for shooting action anyway.
Right.